Reading is interpretation. A poem well read is a poem well understood. In this podcast, brought to you by the Literary Life Podcast, poet Thomas Banks will help you increase your love and understanding of poetry. Poetry is not a silent endeavor. It's meant to be heard, and more importantly, it's meant to be recited out loud. Join us now as poet Thomas Banks presents The Well-Read Poem.
Hello, and welcome to The Well-Read Poem. For this last poem in this fall series, Bad Poems by Great Poets, I selected a sonnet by the English Romantic poet William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth probably does not need much introduction since I have read from him before, and probably many of you are familiar with him already. Along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, John Keats. He's one of the 4 or 5 really first-rank names in English Romantic verse. He is known for Tintern Abbey, The Excursion, The Prelude. Some of the his first major collection, of course, was the lyrical ballads that he co-wrote with Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the late 1790s in the Lake District. So William Wordsworth, by the time he wrote today's poem in the 1820s, was a pretty well-established name in the English literary establishment, and he embarked upon a series in 1822 of what he called the ecclesiastical sonnets. And these are a series of sonnets, a series of 14-line iambic pentameter lyric poems, which deal with some event or figure in the history of the Church of England. This poem that I'm going to read you today has the makings, actually, of a very fine poetic composition. I think it fails where it gets distracted. So it's possible for a poet to get distracted, to pursue a tangent that isn't really relevant to his poem's stated purpose. And so I'm going to read you this one. This one, by the way, I think is, it's one of Wordsworth's lesser poems. I don't want you to think that it's a disaster. I think reading this one, I think, yeah, this has some actually very strong lines, some very well-composed pentameters. I don't think it's unsalvageable, but I think it might have benefited from maybe another draft. And something you should know about this, a little background. This is like the other ecclesiastical sonnets. This is a historic poem. It is actually based on a real occurrence in the history of English religious life, when Henry VIII decided that after his long and bitter series of exchanges with the Pope, dealing with his separation from his wife Catherine of Aragon and his proposed marriage to Anne Boleyn, Henry decided, at the behest of his advisor Thomas Cromwell, that he was going to shut down the monasteries, that all of the English abbeys, nunneries, centers of monastic life, which had flourished in England for 1,000 years, roughly, he was going to appropriate, we would say today, he was going to nationalize the property and, pension the monks and nuns off to go seek a living somewhere else. All right, so this should be an easy subject to give dramatic fire to. It was very much the end of an era in English religious history, and Wordsworth, for some reason, I don't think he finds quite the excitement, quite the historic fire in the subject that it easily could supply. Anyhow, The Dissolution of the Monasteries by William Wordsworth. Threats came which no submission may assuage, no sacrifice avert, no power dispute. The tapers shall be quenched, the belfries mute, and mid their choirs unroofed by selfish rage, the warbling wren shall find a leafy cage, the gadding bramble hang her purple fruit. And the green lizard and the gilded newt lead unmolested lives and die of age. The owl of evening and the woodland fox for their abode the shrines of Waltham choose. Proud Glastonbury can no more refuse to stoop her head before these desperate shocks. She whose high pomp displaced, as story tells, Arimathean Joseph's wattled cells. There's a couple of names in this poem which might seem either obscure in themselves or confusing by their presence. So one that you probably do recognize, Arimathean Joseph, so the famous Saint Joseph of Arimathea, who saw to the burial of our Lord following the crucifixion. There is an old medieval legend that he visited England back in the first century. Again, like many, of these sort of monastic legends, this one doesn't necessarily repose on a basis of fact, but anyway, it's a pious legend that he came to England, visited Glastonbury, and actually that in some versions of this legend, Christ as a young boy comes with him. And Glastonbury, there's the legend of the famous flowering hawthorn where Christ walked and a hawthorn bush sprouted up. So Glastonbury is one of the oldest monastic centers in England. And when it was dissolved, Henry VIII appropriated its great wealth and put an end to 1,000 years and more of devotions there. All right. So Wordsworth here, he seems to spend most of this poem describing scenery, what will become of the monasteries, the particular wild creatures which will populate them when no one lives there anymore. He might have been inspired by one of Shakespeare's sonnets, where Shakespeare refers to the bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang, which has also been taken as a reference to the kind of melancholy, a melancholy response to the dissolution of monastic life in England. So Wordsworth here, he is writing in a recognizable tradition. I don't think that the poem has quite the verve that it needs, though. There's something kind of slow-moving, solemn, and frankly a bit dull about this. A lot of scenery description and not much more. Anyhow, it's not a terrible poem. It's not the worst sonnet that the 19th century produced. Probably not even the worst sonnet that William Wordsworth produced. But when you know what Wordsworth can do, when you've read his lines on Westminster Bridge, when you've read his sonnet on the sonnet, which is simply a sonnet in praise of the sonnet as a form, you know that he's capable of something much greater than this. And here it seems as if he has not put his best foot forward. So let me read this one more time to round out the season. The Dissolution of the Monasteries by William Wordsworth. Threats come which no submission may assuage, no sacrifice avert, no power dispute. The tapers shall be quenched, the belfries mute, and mid their choirs unroofed by selfish rage, the warbling wren shall find a leafy cage, the gadding bramble hang her purple fruit, and the green lizard and the gilded newt lead unmolested lives and die of age. The owl of evening and the woodland fox for their abode the shrines of Waltham choose. Proud Glastonbury can no more refuse to stoop her head before these desperate shocks. She whose high pomp displaced, as story tells, Arimathean Joseph's wattled cells. This has been the Well-Read Poem. Thank you very much.
This has been The Well-Read Poem with poet Thomas Banks, brought to you by the Literary Life podcast. For show notes and the text of the poem, visit theliterary.life. To find out more about Thomas Banks and the poetry resources he offers, go to houseofhumaneletters.com. This podcast is patron-supported. Visit patreon.com/theliterarylife to find out how you can support this podcast and get additional bonus content, including monthly live poetry explications. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for listening.